be a laboratory for terror. And we've stopped that. And we have a very, very good view. I mean, some things are going to be announced over the next couple of weeks as to what happened, who's been taken out. A lot of people have been taken out that were very bad, both ISIS and al-Qaeda.
Welcome back. That was President Trump yesterday talking about the future of Afghanistan, one day after a suicide bomber killed 63 people in Kabul, an attack that ISIS claims responsibility for. According to the new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, 27% of Americans are very worried that the United States will experience another major terrorist attack. Compare that to 55% of Americans who say they are very worried the U.S. will experience another mass shooting or attack by white nationalists. Joining me now, Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS and an MSNBC senior foreign affairs analyst, Brett McGurk. He also recently co-wrote a Washington Post column titled, "We Work to Defeat the Islamic State. White Nationalist Terrorism is an Equal Threat." Mr. McGurk, thank you for joining us. Well, let's pick up on the title of that op-ed, White Nationalist Terrorism, an Equal Threat to ISIS. Explain that.
Well, it's not just myself and General Allen saying that. The FBI director, the assistant director of the FBI in charge of counterterrorism, has said the same thing to the Congress, that the majority of mass casualty attacks in the United States of America since 9/11 have come from domestic threats, primarily from white nationalism movements from the extreme right. So it's a significant threat in the country. The point in that op-ed that we wrote is that obviously the tactics we use against ISIS would not be used against this threat militarily. But other things we did against ISIS, including building a large coalition of international partners to share intelligence, to connect dots, to work with the tech sector here in Silicon Valley to make sure that extremists cannot propagate online and coordinate. Those are things that we can do to prioritize to protect the American people. And right now it's not being done. I mean, American leadership really counts in these sorts of things. After the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand some months ago, about 20 countries around the world and 8 of the major technology companies got together to sign a joint declaration about working together to get this type of extremism off the internet, consistent with the rules and regulations. And the United States refused to sign that declaration. So there's a real void here, and I think it just increases the threat to the American people.
Yeah, you say consistent with trying to get this information out off, consistent with rules and regulations. How much tension and how much conflict as this area is sort of explored? I know it's sort of a new thing for a lot of people. How much tension and conflict do you think there's going to be between principles of liberty, between principles of free expression, and the kinds of threats you're talking about here?
Well, you know, when we started the campaign against ISIS in 2014, they almost had the run of social media. I mean, it was just amazing what was on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook. We worked with the technology companies. We said, look, here are the types of things you look for that are inspiring attacks around the world. And they actually did an incredible job to get the stuff off of their sites. I mean, Twitter's taken down well over 1 million ISIS-affiliated handles. They continue to be very good at it. There's a lot of very similar types of extremism and recruitment that comes from other types of terrorist organizations, including extremism here domestically, domestic terrorist organizations. So it's a dialogue between government and social media organizations is important, is appropriate. The technology companies here in Silicon Valley want it. They claim that they're really not getting much cooperation from Washington. And I think that that's a problem. I think we really all have to work together here. You know, you can connect the dots between attacks in Charleston, just south of here in Southern California, and some of the most recent attacks that happened in El Paso and attacks that have happened around the world in New Zealand, in Norway. These groups are increasingly interconnected. And it's the type of thing that we have to have a kind of whole of government, whole of society effort to try to combat. It's not going to stop every attack, but it's important. Of course, the gun, obviously access to high power, high velocity assault weapons is also a significant problem here in the country, which the president says he's now committed to trying to get after. I hope that's true. But the point is we have to really prioritize this. If you don't prioritize it, you really don't get ahead of the trend lines. And the trend lines right now are quite alarming, as is being reported by the FBI.
Well, while those discussions are taking place, while a strategy is being formulated, whether it's by the government, whether it's by the private sector, whether it's by a partnership, what can we expect? What can we expect as Americans? I know it certainly seems and feels as if the frequency, the intensity of these is picking up. Over the next year, 2 years, do you expect we're going to see even more? Do you expect that the frequency will pick up even more than we've seen?
This is a real question for public policy. It depends on what our government and governments do. I mean, it's an important, a critical issue at the national level in Congress, but it's also an increasingly important issue at the state and local level. You know, there are a lot of credible voices now, such as Admiral Mike Mullen, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President Bush and under President Obama, who wrote a very compelling op-ed in The Atlantic saying that these types of assault weapons have no business being in the hands of civilians. The police chief of Dayton, Ohio, after the terrible shooting there, said the exact same thing. So I think we really have to look at this. I mean, during the 10 years of the assault weapons ban, there was only a couple mass shootings in the country. And since that assault weapons ban expired, there have been almost 24. So the access to these high-powered, high-velocity weapons combined with this threat of extremism and the tendency to self-radicalize online, which is a real phenomenon now, which we have to take seriously, creates a nexus that puts a lot of Americans in danger. So it's a public policy challenge of the first order. It takes leadership from the White House and from the Congress. We obviously have not seen that. And it also takes, I think, local and state governments to fill the void. So, look, the only hope here is that after these terrible events and in the memory of these victims, that our governments can really begin to take this seriously.
All right, Brett McGurk, thank you for taking a few minutes. Appreciate it.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.